My name doesn't matter anymore. Not since that expedition into the upper valleys, where the wind carries prayers older than memory, and the stones themselves seem to whisper warnings. I was born in a village so remote that even the maps forget we exist, clinging to the edge of peaks that scrape the belly of heaven, where my people have lived for generations, counting time not in years, but in seasons of survival. I was a hunter, the best some said, trained by my father and his father before him in the ancient art of reading tracks, understanding weather, and moving through terrain that breaks lesser men like dry wood. My hands knew the weight of my father's rifle, the way a monk knows his prayer beads, and I could sense the presence of barrel and snow leopard from distances that made others call me blessed or cursed, depending on their mood. But there was one hunt, one single journey into the forbidden zones above the tree line, where the old prayer flags hang in tatters like the remnants of forgotten supplications that stripped away everything I thought I knew about these mountains and my place within them. I returned from those heights a different man, hollowed out and refilled with something I still cannot name, carrying a truth so strange and sacred that speaking it aloud feels like blasphemy against the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the world. They see it. In my eyes now, the other hunters, the way I pause before entering certain valleys, the way I no longer boast about my kills or compete for honor in the traditional ways. Something followed me back from that place, not in body, but in essence, a presence that sits behind my ribs and whispers during the long nights when sleep refuses to come, and the stars look down with a knowledge that predates human understanding. I am no longer the man who left that morning with confidence in his step and certainty in his purpose, and I never will be again. The mountains took that version of me and replaced him with someone who knows that the boundaries between myth and flesh are thinner than prayer silk, and that some encounters are less like meetings and more like initiations into mysteries our ancestors understood better than we ever could. This is the story of what changed me, what I saw in those frozen heights where the air is too thin for lies, and the silence speaks louder than any human voice. I tell you this now not for belief or validation, but because keeping it locked inside has become a weight that bends my spine and turns my dreams into landscapes of white fur and ancient eyes that hold the sorrow of centuries. For years I have carried this alone, watching my words die on my tongue whenever someone asks why I no longer venture into certain valleys or why I sometimes stand at the village edge at dusk, staring toward the peaks as if expecting something to emerge from the gathering darkness. The elders see it in me, that particular haunting that comes from brushing against the hidden world, the realm that exists parallel to our daily lives of cooking fires and laughter, and the ordinary miracles we take for granted because they don't challenge our understanding of what is possible. My children ask why I wake gasping, why I keep a single white feather wrapped in silk beneath my pillow, why I make offerings at shrines that others pass without acknowledgement, and I tell them stories that dance around the truth, because the truth itself would sound like madness or fever dream. But you who listen now, you who have perhaps felt the edges of something vast and incomprehensible brushing against the borders of your rational world, perhaps you will understand what I am about to confess. Perhaps you too have stood at the threshold between the known and the unknowable and felt the terrible gravity of mysteries that demand to be witnessed even as they defy all explanation. This testimony is my unburdening, my offering to whatever forces govern the spaces between certainty and wonder, and maybe, just maybe, a beacon for others who have touched the impossible and returned forever changed. The morning I left carried that peculiar quality of stillness that comes before significant events, though I had no way of knowing then that I was walking toward a threshold from which there would be no returning. I rose before dawn as always, moving through the rituals of preparation that had been passed down through generations of hunters in my family, each gesture a prayer of sorts, each item Packed into my canvas bag, a link in a chain of tradition stretching back beyond memory. My father's rifle, oiled and blessed by the village lama 3 winters before his death, felt heavier than usual across my shoulders, as if the metal itself sensed something my conscious mind had not yet grasped. The barrel herd had been spotted by a younger hunter 2 days prior, moving unusually high into the forbidden upper valleys, where the village elder had long ago declared certain peaks off-limits for reasons he would never fully explain, speaking only of old agreements and boundaries that must be honored. But I was proud then, swollen with the confidence that comes from years of successful hunts and the reputation I had built as someone who could track anything across any terrain, and pride makes us deaf to warnings that our wiser selves might heed. My wife touched my arm as I prepared to leave, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary, her eyes searching my face for something she seemed to sense but could not name. And I kissed her forehead with the casual assurance of a man who expects to return unchanged. The village was still sleeping when I passed the last house, only old Tenzin standing at his doorway watching me with an expression I now recognize as recognition, the look of someone who has seen this pattern before and knows how it ends. He called out to me. As I reached the path's beginning, his voice cracked and urgent, speaking of spirits that guard the high places and boundaries that exist for protection rather than superstition. But I waved him off with the arrogance of someone who believes knowledge of rifles and tracking makes him immune to the mysteries that older cultures understood better than we do. The prayer flags at the valley's entrance hung limp in the windless morning, their faded colors barely visible in the pre-dawn gray, and I should have recognized the unnaturalness of that stillness, the way even the birds seemed to have abandoned that particular stretch of mountainside. I touched the nearest flag out of habit, murmuring the half-remembered prayer my grandmother had taught me, feeling the brittle fabric crumble slightly beneath my fingers like ancient skin, but I did not turn back. My breath clouded in the cold air as I began the ascent, following the tracks of the barrel herd deeper into terrain I had never personally explored, though I had heard stories about it around winter fires, when the old ones spoke of places where the veil between worlds grew thin as rice paper. The climbing grew more difficult as the sun finally breached the eastern peaks, painting the snowfields in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if not for the growing unease that had begun to coil in my stomach, like a living thing. The barrel tracks were clear and fresh, leading me higher than any herd should naturally venture, as if something had driven them upward against their instincts, and I began to notice other signs that troubled my hunter's mind, even as I pushed forward with stubborn determination. Small cairns of stones appeared at irregular intervals along the path, arrangements too deliberate to be natural, but too weathered to be recent. Markers of something I could not interpret, though they raised the hair on my neck and made my fingers unconsciously check the rifle's safety. The wind that had been absent at lower elevations now began to rise, carrying with it a strange quality that seemed to pull at my clothes and hair with an urgency that felt almost like communication, almost like warning, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that frost formed on my eyebrows within minutes. I found myself in a narrow gorge I did not remember from any map or story, walls of dark stone, rising on either side, carved with what might have been natural formations, or might have been something else, patterns that suggested intention, even as they defied clear interpretation. The barrel tracks continued forward, but now they were accompanied by something else, impressions in the fresh snow that stopped my breath and made my heart hammer against my ribs with a violence that bordered on panic. They were footprints, massive and clear, each one nearly twice the length of my own boot, and sunk deep into the snow with a weight that spoke of something far larger than any human, spaced in a walking pattern that was unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably purposeful. I knelt beside one of these prints, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the compressed snow, feeling its edges still sharp and fresh, meaning whatever had made them had passed this way within the last few hours, perhaps even less. The print was not the crude impression of a bear's paw or any animal I had encountered in decades of hunting, but showed distinct toe marks and an arch that suggested a foot designed for upright walking, a gait that moved with intelligence and intention towards some destination known only to itself. My training told me to retreat, to mark this location and return with others who could verify what I was seeing. But something deeper than training, something that lived in the marrow of my bones, where instinct and ancient memory reside, pulled me forward along that trail of impossible footprints. The gorge narrowed further until the walls nearly touched overhead, creating a twilight dimness, even though the sun still shone on the peaks above, and the tracks led me inexorably toward a cave mouth that yawned in the northern wall, like a throat waiting to swallow the foolish and the curious. I had hunted these mountains for 30 years and had never seen this cave, never heard it mentioned in any story or marked on any route. Yet here it stood undeniably real, its entrance framed by ice formations that caught the filtered light and threw it back in colors that should not exist in nature. The smell that emanated from that darkness stopped me at the threshold, a scent so powerful and complex it seemed to bypass my nose entirely and communicate directly with some primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey rather than predators. It was musk and earth and something indefinably ancient, organic but not animal in any way I could classify, carrying undertones of herbs I could not name and a sweetness that reminded me inexplicably of the incense burned in the oldest temples, where the paint peels from deity faces that have watched human suffering for 1,000 years. My hands brought the rifle to ready position without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over as my mind struggled to process the wrongness and rightness of this moment. The sense that I had arrived at a place where the normal rules of existence bent and folded into configurations my rational understanding could not accommodate. The footprints led directly into that darkness, disappearing into depths my eyes could not penetrate, and I stood at that threshold, longer than I can measure, caught between the pride that had brought me this far and the wisdom that screamed for retreat. In the end, it was neither courage nor curiosity that moved me forward, but something closer to inevitability, the feeling that this moment had been written long before my birth, and I was simply fulfilling a role in a story whose full shape I could not perceive, but whose gravity I could not resist. Inside the cave, the darkness was not complete, but filtered through ice and stone in ways that created a dim luminescence sufficient to navigate, and what I saw in that strange half-light drove all thoughts of hunting from my mind forever. The walls were not bare rock, but covered in markings, some clearly ancient and weathered beyond interpretation, others seemingly recent, symbols and patterns that suggested communication, record-keeping, perhaps even art, in a form my human aesthetics struggled to comprehend. Arrangements of stones covered the floor in patterns that were undeniably intentional, circles within. Circles, lines radiating from central points, configurations that reminded me simultaneously of constellation maps and mandalas, of scientific diagrams and sacred geometry, as if whoever created them perceived reality through a lens that encompassed both the mathematical and the mystical. Dried wildflowers lay in careful bundles at specific points. Throughout these stone arrangements, varieties I recognized from high summer meadows, mixed with others I had never encountered, their preservation suggesting methods beyond simple air drying, their placement too deliberate to be anything but ritual. But it was the bones that truly unmade my certainty about what was possible, carved pieces of barrel and snow leopard and species I could not identify, worked with tools that left marks unlike any metal I knew, fashioned into objects whose purpose I could only guess at, instruments perhaps, or totems, or keys to doors I did not have the knowledge to perceive. They hung from the ceiling on cords of twisted fiber, turning slowly in air, currents that should not exist in this sealed space, creating soft clicking sounds as they touched one another. a music of bone and stone that seemed to carry meaning in its rhythm. The smell intensified deeper in the cave, that overwhelming musk mixing with mineral dampness and something else, something that made my skin prickle with electricity, and my breathing quicken despite the thin air, a scent that communicated presence and intelligence, and a watchfulness that pressed against me like a physical weight. I realized with a clarity that bordered on revelation that this was not simply a shelter or den, but a dwelling place, a home maintained over what might be decades or centuries by something that possessed not just intelligence, but culture, ritual, an inner life as complex as my own and perhaps far older. My hands shook as I lowered the rifle, the weapon suddenly absurd in this space, bringing a tool of death into what was clearly a place of careful living and deep intention, and I felt the weight of my presumption and ignorance settle on my shoulders like the mountain itself. I do not know how long I stood frozen in that cave before I heard the sound that changed everything, a breathing that was not my own, deep and measured, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond where the strange light penetrated, my entire body locked into the terrible stillness of prey animals. That absolute immobility that comes when movement means death and stillness offers the only thread of hope, though every instinct screamed at me to run, even as my muscles refused to obey. The breathing continued, unhurried and calm, the rhythm of something completely aware of my presence, yet unbothered by it, and I realized with a horror that dissolved my bones that I had been observed from the moment I entered this sacred space, perhaps even before. Perhaps from the moment I began following those massive footprints through the snow. The darkness shifted, and a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows, moving with a silence that should have been impossible for something of such size, and my mind simply refused to process what my eyes reported, rejecting the information as surely as the body rejects poison, because what stood before me could not exist in the world I had constructed through decades of rational hunting and practical living. It rose to full height slowly, deliberately, giving me time to understand the enormity of what I faced. Easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill the cave entrance, covered in fur that caught the dim light like silver water, like moonlight on snow, each hair distinct and purposeful, rather than the rough pelt of any bear or known animal. The face that turned toward me carried an expression I will spend the rest of my life trying to adequately describe, features that sat somewhere in the uncanny valley between human and other, a countenance that held intelligence and emotion in proportions that shattered every certainty I had carried into these mountains. The eyes were what destroyed me, dark and deep as the oldest wells, holding within them a quality of awareness that felt not just sentient but sapient, not merely intelligent but wise, carrying centuries of observation and understanding in their depths, along with something that looked unmistakably like sorrow, profound and ancient as the peaks themselves. We stood regarding each other across a distance of perhaps 15 feet, hunter and legend, mortal and myth, and I felt the categories by which I had organized reality crumble like the prayer flags at the valley's entrance, inadequate structures collapsing under the weight of truth they were never designed to support. The rifle hung forgotten in my hands, as relevant to this moment as a child's toy, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I had never been the hunter in this scenario, but always the one being tracked, led, brought to this place for purposes I could not begin to fathom. The creature made no aggressive move, showed no sign of threat, despite the fact that it could have ended my life with casual ease, instead continuing to watch me with those impossible eyes that seemed to see not just my body, but deeper, into the architecture of my soul and the shape of my intentions. Time lost meaning in that cave as we maintained our strange communion. Seconds stretching into eternities, or perhaps hours compressing into moments, measurements becoming irrelevant when reality itself has shifted into a different register entirely. Then it moved, and the movement carried such deliberate grace that I knew immediately this was communication, a message being sent across the gap between our species with careful intention. The creature brought its massive hands together in front of its chest, fingers interlaced in a configuration I had seen countless times in my grandmother's small shrine room, a gesture of offering and respect used by monks during certain ceremonies, a stance that spoke of peace and spiritual intention rather than physical threat. My grandmother's voice echoed across the decades in my memory, her stories of the mountain guardians who walked the high places maintaining the balance between worlds, tales I had dismissed as colorful folklore meant to keep children from wandering too far from the village. But here before me stood the validation of those stories, the proof that our ancestors' understanding of these mountains encompassed truths that modern rationality had discarded as primitive superstition, and I felt the foundations of my worldview crack and reform around this impossible reality. Tears streamed down my face, though I could not have said whether they came from fear or awe, or the overwhelming recognition that I had stumbled into something sacred and profound, a mystery that humans had perhaps once understood but had chosen or been forced to forget. The creature held the gesture, patient and still, waiting for some response I did not know how to give, and I found my own hands moving without conscious direction, awkwardly mimicking that ancient stance, my rough hunter's fingers trying to approximate the sacred configuration, while my mind reeled at what I was doing, at the threshold I was crossing. The creature's eyes reflected something that might have been approval or satisfaction or perhaps relief, as if my response had answered a question or fulfilled a requirement. Then it turned with startling swiftness and moved deeper into the cave, pausing after a few steps to look back at me with clear expectation. Every survival instinct I possessed warned against following, screamed that darkness and confinement with this impossible being meant certain death. But something deeper overrode those warnings, a pull that felt older than instinct, more fundamental than fear, a recognition that this moment was gift rather than threat, invitation rather than trap. I followed, my legs trembling but obedient, leaving behind the last vestiges of the man who had climbed into these mountains with his father's rifle and his proud certainty about the nature of existence, stepping forward into mystery and transformation with nothing but faith that some purposes are worth the surrendering of everything we think we know. The darkness swallowed us both, hunter and guardian, and I understood that I was being led not to my death, but to something far more dangerous and precious, a truth that would remake me so completely that return to ordinary life would become impossible, a knowing that would mark me forever as someone who had crossed boundaries meant to remain inviolate, and emerged carrying secrets the modern world has no language to contain. The passage through the cave lasted minutes or hours, I could not say, but eventually opened into a chamber where pale light filtered through cracks in the mountain spine, illuminating a space that stopped my breath with its impossible beauty and strangeness. The walls were marked with symbols I did not recognize, carved with tools or claws I could not imagine, patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I looked away and back again, suggesting meaning just beyond the reach of my comprehension. Along the floor lay arrangements that spoke of deliberate placement rather than natural accumulation. Circles of smooth stones nested within each other like ripples frozen in time, bundles of dried wildflowers tied with what appeared to be woven grass, their preserved petals still holding colors that defied the darkness of this place. Among these offerings I saw bones carved with such delicacy that they resembled lace, forming shapes that might have been letters or prayers or maps to territories that existed beyond the physical realm. The creature moved among these artifacts with clear reverence, adjusting a stone here, straightening a bundle there, maintaining this sacred space with the careful attention of a monk tending his temple. I watched, transfixed, as those massive hands, which could easily crush a barrel's skull, handled these delicate objects with infinite gentleness. And I understood I was witnessing something profoundly intimate, being allowed into a private devotion that perhaps no other human had ever seen. The smell that had driven my instincts toward panic now revealed layers of complexity, not the stench of an animal's den, but the rich earthiness of ancient places, mixed with dried herbs and something else, something that reminded me of incense burning in my grandmother's shrine, sacred smoke carrying prayers to realms beyond ordinary knowing. My fear had not disappeared, but transformed into something more nuanced, a recognition that danger and holiness often inhabit the same spaces, that what can destroy us might also sanctify us if we approach with proper reverence. As the creature completed its circuit of the chamber, I found myself kneeling without conscious decision, my body responding to the sanctity of this place with gestures older than thought, honoring mysteries I could name only through surrender. The creature turned its attention fully to me then, and I felt the weight of that gaze like physical pressure, not threatening, but assessing, measuring something essential about my presence here. It moved closer, each step deliberate and slow, giving me time to bolt if terror overcame whatever thread of trust held me in place, demonstrating an understanding of fear and consent that seemed impossibly sophisticated. When it stood directly before me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from its massive form, it extended one enormous hand palm upward in a gesture that transcended species, universal language of offering and request combined. I stared at that hand, the palm surprisingly human in its basic architecture, despite the scale and the thick padding designed for gripping frozen stone. Fingers that could have circled my entire chest, spread open in perfect vulnerability. Something in my heart cracked open like spring ice, and I reached forward with my own trembling hand, placing it against that vast palm, with the solemnity of a vow being spoken, a covenant being sealed between worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other. The contact sent a shock through my entire system. Not painful but overwhelming, sensation and information flooding through me faster than my mind could process, as if that simple touch had opened channels long closed, between human consciousness and something older, deeper, more connected to the mountain's ancient dreaming. Images flickered behind my eyes, though they remained open, visions that might have been memory or prophecy, or some category for which I had no name. Vast migrations across snowfields, under stars arranged in configurations I did not recognize, temples carved into peaks that no longer existed, or perhaps had not yet come to be. The creature's eyes held mine throughout this strange communion, and I saw reflected in their depths an emotion I finally recognized, because I felt its mirror rising in my own chest. Loneliness, profound and aching, the isolation of being the last of something precious, the only keeper of knowledge the world had decided to forget. Time folded strangely in that sacred chamber as we maintained our connection, and I felt rather than heard the creature communicating something essential, not through words, but through images and emotions, and knowing that bypassed language entirely. I understood it, was showing me purpose, revealing that these arrangements of stone and flower and bone were not mere decoration, but active maintenance, rituals that held something crucial in place, kept some balance from tipping toward catastrophe that humanity in its modern arrogance could no longer perceive. The creature was a guardian indeed, as my grandmother's stories had named it, but not of territory or treasure as the tales suggested, rather of thresholds and boundaries between what should remain separate, keeper of doors that must stay closed, and paths that must stay hidden for the world's own protection. I saw in the visions it shared that there had once been many, a whole community, of guardians maintaining their watch across the high places, but time and human expansion had reduced their numbers until perhaps only this one remained, carrying alone a burden meant for multitudes. The sorrow in its eyes was not self-pity, but grief for the world, for the loss of balance, for the thinning of the veil between human ambition and consequences they refused to acknowledge. When it finally withdrew its hand, breaking our contact with gentleness that suggested reluctance, I found my face wet with tears again, weeping not from fear, but from the devastating privilege of being seen and trusted by something so ancient, so alone, so dedicated to service that would never be recognized or honored by those it protected. The creature gestured toward the cave entrance with something that looked like urgency, and I understood our time here was ending, that dawn or danger or some other force was requiring this encounter to conclude, but not before it had changed me so thoroughly that the man who would descend from these mountains would be unrecognizable to himself. The creature led me back through the darkness with sure steps while I stumbled behind, my body exhausted by experiences my mind had no framework to process, and when we emerged into twilight air that burned my lungs with its sudden cold, I saw we stood in a completely different location than where I had entered. Before us stretched a narrow pass I had never seen, despite decades of hunting these mountains, and the creature indicated with clear direction that I should follow this path, that it would lead me back toward the human world I had temporarily transcended. It did not follow as I took my first uncertain steps, instead remaining at the threshold between cave and sky, watching my departure with those eyes that now felt less alien than heartbreakingly familiar. Lonely beyond my capacity to fully comprehend, yet somehow grateful for this brief connection across the vast distance between our kinds. I turned back once, twice, 3 times as I walked, each time finding it still there, still watching, massive and patient and impossibly alone, until the 4th time, when I looked and found only stone and snow and gathering darkness, as if it had never existed at all except as vision or dream, or the kind of truth that reality accommodates only briefly before reasserting its more comfortable lies. The descent through that hidden base should have brought relief, the familiar rhythm of walking downward towards safety and comprehension, but instead, each step felt like a betrayal, abandoning something sacred to return to a world that suddenly seemed small and deaf to truths I could no longer ignore. My body moved mechanically, while my mind replayed the visions the creature had shared, trying to hold on to details already slipping away, like dreams upon waking, the specific images fading, but the emotional weight remaining heavy in my chest, like a stone I would carry forever. The path wound through rock formations that seemed deliberately shaped, natural pillars that might have been sculpted or might have grown, according to some geometry older than human mathematics. And I wondered if the creature had carved these passages, or if the mountain itself had formed them, offering corridors between worlds for those rare travelers who earned the right to walk them. Night fell completely as I navigated switchbacks that appeared and disappeared with unsettling fluidity, and I became increasingly uncertain whether I was following a physical trail or being guided by something less tangible, some thread of intention the creature had woven into my consciousness during our communion. The temperature dropped viciously, and wind rose with sudden fury, driving snow horizontally across my path until visibility reduced to mere feet, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was being tested one final time, that safe passage was not guaranteed simply because I had been shown the way. Part of me wanted to rage against this trial, to demand fairness after everything I had witnessed and endured, but a deeper wisdom recognized that sacred knowledge always carries a price. That transformation requires the death of who we were before, and perhaps I needed to prove I valued what had been shared by surviving this final ordeal through my own determination and faith. The storm intensified beyond anything I had experienced in 40 years of mountain hunting, wind tearing at my clothing with claws that seemed personal in their malice, snow accumulating so rapidly that each footstep sank knee-deep, and cold penetrating through every layer until my core temperature began the dangerous slide toward hypothermia. I lost the path completely within an hour, Or perhaps it had never been as clear as I imagined, and I stumbled through whiteout conditions with no sense of direction, no way to distinguish up from down in the disorienting fury of the blizzard. My thoughts began to fragment as my body diverted blood from my brain to protect vital organs. Memories of my father teaching me to track, my grandmother whispering stories by firelight, my wife's worried face when I left for expeditions, all bleeding, together with the visions the creature had shared, until I could not separate my own history from the ancient knowledge it had given me. I fell countless times, each time taking longer to rise, the seductive whisper of rest growing more persuasive, promising relief from this endless struggle if I would just surrender to the snow's cold embrace. In those moments of near surrender, I felt the creature's presence again, not physically, but as a weight behind my eyes, a pressure in my chest that pushed me back to my feet with stubborn insistence, as if it had invested something of itself in my survival and refused to let me waste the gift of our encounter by dying stupidly in a storm. I do not know if this was real intervention or my own survival instinct, clothed in the form most likely to motivate me, but I rose each time and continued forward, driven by something beyond personal preservation, carrying the responsibility of witness, the burden of being the only human alive who knew what still kept watch in these mountains. Dawn found me collapsed against a boulder I vaguely recognized, the storm having passed as abruptly as it arrived, revealing I had somehow descended to within a few hours of my village, though I had no conscious memory of navigating the technical sections that should have killed me in darkness and whiteout conditions. My hands were blackened with frostbite, my face burned and cracked, my body trembling with exhaustion so profound that breathing felt like labor beyond my capacity, yet I was alive against all reasonable probability. As consciousness fully returned and I assessed my condition, I noticed something clutched in my frozen right hand, fingers locked around it with rigor that required my left, and to pry them open, revealing an object that stopped my heart with its impossible presence, a single feather, longer than my forearm, purest white with subtle iridescence that shifted between silver and gold in the rising sunlight. No bird of this region possessed such plumage, and no bird of any region I knew could produce a feather of such size and strange beauty, yet here it lay solid and undeniable in my damaged hand, proof that the previous night had been more than hypothermic hallucination. I stared at this artifact from an encounter I was already beginning to. The creature's gesture froze me more completely than any physical threat could have, my rifle hanging useless at my side. As my mind struggled to reconcile what my eyes witnessed with everything I believed possible about the natural world and its inhabitants, its massive arms moved with deliberate slowness, crossing at the wrists before extending palms upward in the precise configuration my grandmother had demonstrated countless times when telling stories of wandering monks who carried blessings through mountain passes, offering protection to travelers and animals alike. This was not mimicry or coincidence. The angle of the wrists, the specific curve of the fingers, the slight bow of the head that accompanied the gesture, every detail matched the ritual form preserved in our oldest traditions, performed now by a creature that should not exist, that should not possess knowledge of human sacred customs, that should not be standing before me in a posture of spiritual offering rather than territorial aggression. My grandmother's voice echoed across decades. The mountains remember what we have forgotten, and some guardians wear forms we no longer recognize as holy. I had dismissed her words as poetic metaphor, the beautiful nonsense of old age. But watching this impossible being hold a ceremonial stance older than our village, I felt the foundations of my understanding crack and shift beneath me like unstable scree. Terror and wonder warred within me as the Yeti maintained its position. Patient as stone, waiting for a response I had no knowledge of how to provide. my body locked between the instinct to flee and the overwhelming recognition that I stood before something far beyond my capacity to categorize or comprehend. The setting sun caught in its fur, creating a halo effect that made it appear almost luminous, and its eyes held steady on mine with an intelligence that made my skin prickle with the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen, evaluated, and found both wanting and somehow worthy of this incomprehensible gesture. My hands trembled as I slowly lowered my rifle to the snow, the action feeling simultaneously like surrender and like the only appropriate response to what was being offered, though I could not have articulated what exactly that offering was or what accepting it might mean for my future. Some part of me understood that this moment represented a threshold, that what I did in the next seconds would determine not just whether I survived this encounter, but whether I would leave this mountain as the same man who had climbed it that morning with such arrogant confidence in my understanding of nature's hierarchy. The creature's breathing was audible now in the thin air, steady and deep, and I realized it was generating a low, harmonic sound, almost a chant, that vibrated in my chest cavity and seemed to resonate with something buried deep in my genetic memory, something that recognized this sound before language existed to name it. Without conscious decision, my own hands began to move, mimicking the gesture with trembling uncertainty, my fingers arranging themselves in the offering configuration my grandmother had taught me as a child during ceremonies I had stopped believing in as I grew into the rational world of rifles and measured distances. The moment my hands completed the form, the creature's entire demeanor shifted subtly, a visible relaxation passing through its massive frame, and it produced a sound that might have been approval or relief, a rumbling exhalation that carried warmth across the cold space between us. It lowered its arms and turned slowly, moving with surprising grace for something so large, and began walking along the ridge toward a section of mountain face that appeared from my angle to be solid rock, without pathway or passage. Every instinct screamed warnings about following, about abandoning the known trail for unknown. Purposes guided by an entity I could not begin to understand, yet my legs moved forward without consulting my conscious mind, drawn by a compulsion that felt older than choice, more fundamental than fear. The rational hunter I had been that morning would have never taken this step, would have retreated to village and sanity, but that hunter had died the moment the creature performed a gesture that should not exist in its repertoire, and whoever I was becoming had no choice but to follow where this impossible teacher led. The path revealed itself only as we approached what I had thought was blank stone, a narrow cleft becoming visible at the precise angle of our approach, hidden by an optical effect of overlapping rock faces that would fool any eye not guided to the exact position. The creature moved through this opening without hesitation, its broad shoulders barely fitting through the gap, and after a moment's hesitation, during which I inventory every reason not to follow and rejected them all as irrelevant against the magnitude of what was being offered, I stepped into the passage behind it. The space inside was darker than the twilight outside, my eyes struggling to adjust as I followed the sound of the creature's movement and the faint luminescence its fur seemed to generate, an almost phosphorescent quality that defied natural explanation. The passage wound through living rock, smooth in places as if worn by countless passages, rough in others as if recently opened, and the temperature increased noticeably as we descended, suggesting proximity to geothermal activity in these volcanically formed mountains. After what might have been minutes or hours, time having lost its reliable progression, the passage opened into a space filled with sound and warmth and the unmistakable mineral smell of hot springs, and I emerged into a grotto that stole what remained of my rational understanding of the world I thought I had mastered through 40 years of careful observation and methodical hunting. The grotto stretched before me like a cathedral carved by gods I had no names for, steam rising from a series of connected pools that glowed with an ethereal blue-green luminescence from minerals or algae beyond my knowledge to identify. The walls were lined with objects that transformed this natural space into something unmistakably sacred. Hundreds of skulls arranged in precise geometric patterns, not scattered or haphazard, but deliberately placed according to some organizing principle I could not decipher. Their empty eye sockets watching the chamber with patient attention. Between the skulls hung prayer flags so ancient their colors had faded to uniform gray, their mantras barely visible but still present, still holding whatever intention had placed them here decades or centuries ago. Offerings covered every available surface, bowls of stones, arrangements of feathers, parcels wrapped in decaying cloth that might have once contained food or incense, creating a museum of devotion that suggested this place had been visited by humans long before my arrival, by people who had known what I was only beginning to suspect. The Yeti moved through this space with the familiarity of long habitation, its footsteps generating soft echoes that seemed to harmonize with the bubbling of the thermal pools, and I understood with sudden clarity that this creature was not a visitor to this shrine, but its keeper, its guardian, possibly its priest. My legs trembled as I followed, each step feeling like trespass and invitation simultaneously, the weight of countless generations of secrecy pressing down on my shoulders with almost physical force. The heat was intense after the mountain cold, making my skin prickle and sweat despite the chill still locked in my bones, and I wondered if this transition from one extreme to another was intentional, a ritual purification or test of commitment. The creature approached the largest of the pools and knelt beside it with a reverence that confirmed my suspicion about the sacred nature of this place, its massive hands cupping the steaming water and bringing it to its mouth in a gesture of obvious ritual significance. It drank slowly, deliberately, then turned its head toward me with an expression that conveyed unmistakable expectation, its eyes reflecting the pool's strange luminescence and holding a question that transcended language but communicated its meaning with perfect clarity. Every cautionary tale I had ever heard about. Strange waters and mountain fever flooded my mind. Stories of travelers who drank from cursed springs and lost their way home. Of hunters who accepted offerings from spirits and never returned to human form. Of wells that granted visions at the cost of sanity. Yet I also remembered my grandmother's voice speaking of sacred waters that separated those worthy of ancient knowledge from those who would misuse it, of initiation rites that required courage beyond physical bravery, the courage to allow transformation even when its destination remained unknown. The creature continued to watch, patient and still, and I realized this was the true threshold, that the gesture on the ridge had been only preparation for this moment of actual choice. My father's rifle remained useless on my back, my hunter's skills irrelevant to this test, and I stood stripped of all the identities I had constructed across 4 decades of life in these mountains. The skull-lined walls seemed to lean inward, pressing the question closer, and I wondered whose bones these were, previous seekers who had failed some requirement, or honored dead whose presence blessed those who passed through this trial. The creature made a soft sound, not threatening but encouraging, a rumble that carried warmth despite the obvious power in its massive chest, and I understood that whatever waited in those waters had been offered to others before me, that this path had been walked by human feet, even if those humans had left no records in our village histories. My hands shook as I approached the pool's edge and knelt on stone worn smooth by countless genuflections, the heat rising from the water intense enough to make my eyes water and my throat constrict. The smell was overwhelming, sulfur and minerals and something else, something organic and sweet that might have been dissolved plant matter, or might have been something I had no framework to identify. I could see my reflection on the pool's surface between rising steam clouds, my face looking haggard and wild-eyed, transformed already by what I had witnessed. Even before drinking whatever initiation this water represented, the creature shifted beside me, its presence massive and solid, and placed one enormous hand on my shoulder with surprising gentleness, the weight of it grounding me in physical reality, even as everything else about this experience defied rational explanation. That touch communicated reassurance and gravity in equal measure, an acknowledgement that what I was about to do mattered, that consequences would follow, that there would be no return to the innocent ignorance I had carried up the mountain that morning. I cupped my hands into the luminescent water, feeling its heat against my calloused palms, and noticed that the liquid had an unusual viscosity, thicker than normal water, clinging to my skin with persistent warmth. The creature's breathing deepened, taking on that harmonic quality again, and I realized it was creating a sonic environment for this moment, a vibrational context that made my decision feel less like individual choice and more like participation in a ceremony that had occurred countless times across vast stretches of history. As I raised the water toward my lips, I caught a glimpse of carvings on the pool's interior wall, symbols that might have been script or might have been decorative, rendered in a style that matched nothing in my cultural education, and understood that I was drinking from a source that predated my people's arrival in these mountains, that connected to roots deeper than our village's oldest memories. The water touched my lips, and I drank, its taste simultaneously bitter and sweet, metallic and organic, triggering a cascade of sensations that began in my mouth and spread through my body with alarming speed. Heat flooded my veins, not painful but intense, and my vision blurred, then sharpened beyond normal human capacity, details of the grotto suddenly visible with hallucinogenic clarity. Individual mineral crystals in the rock walls, the precise age rings in ancient wooden offering bowls, the micro-expressions crossing the creature's face as it watched my reaction with obvious concern and approval. Time became unstable, moments stretching and compressing without pattern, and I lost track of whether I was still kneeling by the pool or had fallen backward, whether the creature was supporting me or I was floating in the thermal water itself. Images flooded my consciousness that were not memories, but felt more real than memory. Vast migrations of people moving through Ice Age valleys, temples carved into mountains that no longer existed or had been buried by geological time, and woven through everything. The presence of these creatures, these guardians, walking beside humanity not as animals but as companions, teachers, keepers of knowledge we had somehow lost or abandoned. I saw my grandmother as a young woman in this very grotto, drinking from this same pool, receiving these same visions, and understood why she had never spoken directly about what she knew, why her stories had been wrapped in metaphor and poetry, because some truths cannot be transmitted through simple telling but must be experienced to be believed, must be earned through the risk of transformation. The creature's eyes met mine across whatever distance separated us, and in that gaze I felt the weight of profound loneliness, centuries of isolation spent maintaining vigil over sacred places that humans no longer visited, protecting knowledge that humans no longer sought, waiting with patient sorrow for the rare individual who might stumble into remembering what we had collectively forgotten. The loneliness I perceived in that gaze was not the simple isolation of physical separation, but something far more devastating, the existential solitude of being the last keeper of a dying covenant, the final guardian of truths that a forgetful world no longer valued enough to seek. Through our locked eyes flowed an understanding that should have been impossible, a direct transmission of experience that bypassed language entirely and spoke in the older vocabulary of shared consciousness. And I realized with dawning horror and wonder that this creature had been waiting not for years, but for lifetimes, maintaining its vigil through generations of human ignorance, while hope slowly eroded into resignation. I saw through its perspective The mountains transformed across centuries, watched glaciers advance and retreat, witnessed the gradual disappearance of other beings like itself until it stood, alone, the last of a people who had chosen this sacred duty over the comfort of extinction, who had accepted eternal isolation as the price of preserving what humans might someday remember they had lost. Tears froze on my cheeks, though the grotto was warm. My body, responding to emotional anguish that was not mine yet, became mine in the sharing. And I understood that this moment of connection was both gift and burden, that I was being shown something precious and being asked to carry its weight forward into a world that would reject or ridicule what I had witnessed. The creature's hand remained on my shoulder, anchoring me as the visions intensified, and I felt the question embedded in every image. Would I be different? Would I remember? Would I honor what had been shared? Or would I join the countless others who had returned to human life and chosen comfortable denial over difficult truth? The visions shifted from past to present, showing me the world through eyes that perceived what human senses could not detect, the energetic signatures of living things, the vibrational networks connecting all consciousness, the sacred geometries underlying natural formations that we had learned to see as random or merely aesthetic. I watched my own village from the creature's perspective during its nocturnal visits, saw the patterns of our lives illuminated like bioluminescent tracks, and recognized with shame how small our concerns appeared against the vast tapestry of existence that this being navigated with natural ease. It had watched my grandmother during her own initiation, had recognized in her the potential for remembering, and had extended to her the same offering it now gave to me, not salvation or magic, but simply the restoration of a more complete way of seeing, a remembering of capacities that humans once possessed before we chose the comfort of smaller perceptions and simpler explanations. I saw the moment of her death through the creature's awareness, felt its grief as another connection to humanity dissolved, and understood that it had been waiting to see if her bloodline would produce another individual capable of receiving what she had carried in silence for 60 years. My heart hammered against my ribs as the implications cascaded through my understanding. I was not a random hunter who had stumbled into mystery, but the product of selection and patience chosen before my birth by forces I had never suspected existed, and every step that had brought me to this mountain had been simultaneously choice and destiny, free will and choreography impossible to distinguish. The final vision seized me with physical force that drove the breath from my lungs and sent my consciousness spiraling into a perspective so alien I nearly fragmented. Under its vastness, I became the mountain itself, aware of every creature moving across my slopes, every root system drilling through my stone, every thermal current rising from my heated core, experiencing time as a slow dance of geological transformation, where human lifetimes passed like single heartbeats, and the rise and fall of civilizations registered as brief weather patterns across my eternal face. Within this awareness existed pockets of concentrated sacredness, where the membrane between material and spiritual became permeable, where beings like the Yeti maintained their vigil as living acupuncture needles in the Earth's energetic body, and I understood that what I had called a creature was actually a function, a role, a conscious node in a vast network of guardianship that protected not places but possibilities, keeping open the doorways through which transformation might enter human experience. The grotto was one such doorway. My grandmother had been another, and now the question hung in the luminescent air around. Me, would I become a doorway myself? Would I accept the responsibility of being a threshold between the world of comfortable ignorance and the world of dangerous remembering? The weight of that question was crushing, because I understood that acceptance would cost me everything familiar, would exile me from normal human society, even as I continued To walk among my people would transform me into something neither fully what I had been, nor fully what the creature represented, but something between, something perpetually stranded at the border of two incompatible ways of being. When I finally returned to my own eyes, my own kneeling body beside the thermal pool, the creature was weeping, tears, tracking through silver-white fur that caught the pool's luminescence and glowed like phosphorescent rivers down its massive face. It had shown me everything, given me the full burden of its truth, and now waited with obvious anguish to see what I would do with knowledge that could either awaken or destroy, heal or madden, depending on the strength of the vessel that received it. Its hand trembled on my shoulder, this being of impossible power, reduced to vulnerability by hope. It had learned too many times not to trust, and I realized that my choice would matter to it far more than my life or death, that it had endured centuries of isolation specifically to find humans capable of carrying forward what it protected, and that my rejection would wound it more deeply than any hunter's bullet ever could. The skulls lining the walls suddenly held new meaning. Not victims or failures, but honored graduates of this initiation, humans who had drunk from the sacred pool and become something more, whose bones had been brought here, after death, to rest in the place where their transformation had begun, creating a congregation of witnesses whose empty eyes blessed rather than judged. I opened my mouth to speak, though I had no idea what words could possibly bridge the chasm between what I had been when I entered this mountain and what I was becoming in its hidden heart. But before sound could form, the creature released a low moan of recognition that suggested it had already seen my answer in my eyes, had already read my decision in the set of my shoulders, and knew that regardless of what my mouth might say, my soul had already crossed the threshold from which there would be no return. I stumbled back into the village 7 days after I had left, though my mind could not account for how those days had passed or what path my feet had followed through snowfields that should have killed me. My hands were blackened with frostbite to the second knuckle, my lips cracked and bleeding, my father's rifle lost somewhere in the high valleys, yet clutched against. My chest was a single feather as long as my forearm, white as winter moonlight, belonging to no bird that science had ever documented. The villagers found me collapsed at the prayer wheel near the monastery gate, mumbling in a language that the oldest monk said sounded like the ancient tongue his master's master had spoken, words that predated our current dialect by centuries. They carried me to the healer's house, where I drifted in and out of fever dreams, always seeing those eyes watching me with impossible depth, always feeling the weight of transmission settling into my bones, like sediment layering at the bottom of a sacred lake. When I finally surfaced to full consciousness 3 days later, I tried to explain what had happened, tried to describe the grotto and the creature and the visions that had rewritten my understanding of existence. But the words emerged broken and inadequate, like trying to capture an ocean in cupped hands. The younger villagers exchanged knowing glances that said they believed I had suffered altitude, sickness and hallucination, that the mountains had taken my reason the way they occasionally took men who ventured too far alone, and their pity was worse than their disbelief because it came wrapped in kindness that dismissed the most important thing that had ever happened to me. Only the village elder listened with different eyes, sitting beside my bed in the flickering butter lamplight while the others slept, his weathered face unreadable as I spoke of the creature's tears and the congregation of skulls and the moment when I became the mountain itself. When I finished, he remained silent for so long, I thought he too would offer gentle dismissal, but then he reached beneath his wool vest and withdrew a leather pouch worn soft with decades of handling, opening it to reveal a feather identical to mine, its white surface catching the lamplight with the same ethereal quality. His voice emerged rough with emotion he had clearly stored for years, telling me that my grandmother had returned from the mountains with the same token. 63 years ago, that she had tried to speak of her encounter and been met with the same mixture of concern and disbelief, that she had spent the rest of her life maintaining a private vigil the family had attributed to eccentricity rather than purpose. She had sworn him to secrecy before her death, making him promise to watch her descendants for signs of the calling, to recognize if the mountains chose another from her bloodline, and to offer that person the one gift she wished someone had given her, the simple acknowledgement that what they experienced was real, was important, was worth the cost it would exact. He pressed his palm against my forehead, not to check for fever, but in blessing, his eyes bright with tears, as he told me I would lose much in the coming years, would find myself increasingly unable to participate in the ordinary concerns that occupied other men, would become a stranger in my own life, even as I continued to inhabit it, but that this alienation was not madness or curse, but the natural consequence of having seen beyond the veil that keeps most humans comfortable in their limited perception. The years that followed proved his prophecy accurate with devastating precision, as I found myself unable to return to hunting, unable to marry though several families offered daughters, unable to participate in village celebrations with anything more than distant politeness, while my real attention remained turned toward the high valleys. I became known as the man who went strange, who spent weeks at a time in the mountains with minimal supplies, who returned with nothing to show for his journeys except increasing withdrawal from normal human fellowship, who filled journals with drawings and observations that no one understood or valued. The children began to avoid me, sensing the difference that their parents attributed to damage or disappointment, not recognizing that I was learning to perceive the world the way the creature had shown me, developing sensitivity to the energetic patterns underlying material reality, becoming slowly capable of navigating the membrane between worlds that most humans never knew existed. I searched constantly for the grotto, for any sign of the Yeti, following intuition and dreams through countless expeditions that yielded only brief moments of connection, a massive footprint in fresh snow, a pile of arranged stones that carried intentional blessing, a glimpse of silver-white fur vanishing into storm darkness that might have been real or might have been desperate hope manifesting as vision. My family worried, and the village whispered, but the elder understood, occasionally joining me at the prayer wheel, where we would sit in companionable silence. Two men who had been entrusted with impossible knowledge and had chosen to honor it, despite the isolation that choice demanded. Now, after more than 20 years of searching, I understand that I am no longer hunting for the creature, but have instead become what it needed me to become, another guardian, another node in the network of remembering, another threshold, through which the sacred might enter human awareness if anyone proves willing to approach. The young hunters occasionally seek me out before their first solo expeditions. Drawn by instinct, they cannot name to receive blessings I offer, in gestures my grandmother taught me and the Yeti confirmed. And sometimes I see in their eyes a glimmer of the capacity that called to the mountains, a readiness that suggests the lineage continues, the selection proceeds, the ancient covenant still seeks human partners, despite our species' determined forgetting. I keep both feathers now, mine and my grandmother's, wrapped together in the leather pouch I wear against my heart, and I watch the high valleys. With patience, I have learned from a being who measured time in centuries rather than seasons, who chose eternal loneliness over abandoning sacred duty, who wept because it dared to hope that humans might finally remember what we have lost. Whether I met a creature of flesh and blood, a spirit guardian taking temporary form, or something beyond, either category for which we have no adequate language, no longer seems like the important question. Because what matters is that I was chosen to carry forward a truth the world desperately needs, even as it ridicules those who speak it. That we are not alone, not separate, not the pinnacle of consciousness, but rather children who have forgotten our place in a family vast beyond comprehension, and that the path home still exists for those willing to pay the price of remembering, still guarded by beings whose love for humanity endures, despite every reason for abandonment, still open to anyone brave enough to follow mysterious footprints into forbidden valleys where ancient covenants wait with infinite patience for the moment when we finally become ready to return. I return to the mountains now, not as a hunter seeking prey, nor as a seeker expecting revelation, but as something more fundamental, a witness, a keeper of thresholds, a man who has learned that some truths cannot be possessed but only served. The village below has grown, smaller over the decades, young people leaving for cities where electric lights drown out the stars and concrete walls separate humans from the whispers that travel through stone and wind. And I watch this exodus with sadness but without judgment, understanding that each soul must walk its own circular path toward remembering. My body has aged into the landscape, my face weathered to the same texture as the prayer flags that snap in the high-altitude winds, my hands steady, not with a hunter's tension, but with the calm of a man who has released the need for certainty and learned to rest in the vast question that the Yeti embodied. Sometimes months pass between my expeditions now, my knees protesting the steep climbs and my lungs laboring in the thin air. But I go anyway because the covenant does not release its holders simply because flesh grows tired and because I have nowhere else to be that matters more than these vigils in the places where the membrane grows thin. The feathers have become my prayer beads, my compass, my evidence that I did not imagine the encounter that reorganized my existence. And when doubt visits in the dark hours before dawn, I hold them and remember the impossible tenderness in those ancient eyes, the deliberate grace of those massive hands forming gestures of blessing, the tears that spoke of loneliness so profound it had worn grooves into eternity itself. What I have come to understand, in the way that understanding arrives after decades of living inside a question rather than demanding immediate answers, is that the Yeti was not simply showing me a sacred place or offering esoteric knowledge, but was instead extending an invitation into a form of consciousness that humans abandoned when we chose mastery over kinship, dominion over participation. The visions it transmitted were not memories from its individual life, but something more like ancestral knowledge carried in the body, a living archive of the epochs when humans and other forms of awareness moved through the world as relatives rather than as conqueror and resource, when we recognized mountains and rivers and ancient beings as persons deserving respect rather than as obstacles or opportunities. In making me feel the weight of its loneliness, the creature was not seeking pity, but attempting to help me comprehend the magnitude of what our species has lost. Not just knowledge of other intelligences sharing this world, but the very capacity for the kind of perception that would allow us to recognize them, to enter into relationship, to participate in the great conversation that continues all around us, in frequencies we have trained ourselves to ignore. My grandmother understood this, I believe, which is why she spent her final decades in contemplative silence rather than desperate advocacy, recognizing that this truth cannot be argued or proven, but only demonstrated through the gradual transformation of a life, through the patient embodiment of a different way of being that might eventually inspire curiosity in those with eyes to see beyond the consensus trance. The ultimate consequence of my encounter is not that I possess secret knowledge that elevates me above others, but that I have been irreversibly conscripted into a responsibility I never sought and cannot refuse, to maintain the watch, to keep the threshold accessible, to remain available for transmission should the creature or others like it choose again to reach across the chasm our species has created. This sounds perhaps like burden, and in the currency of normal human happiness, it certainly has cost me the conventional comforts of family and belonging and respected place in community. But in the deeper accounting that I have learned to value, it has given me the only thing that ultimately matters: authentic. Participation in the living mystery, direct experience of the sacred, confirmation that existence is far stranger and more generous than the small stories our culture tells about reality. I am old now, and will not see many more winters, and I have accepted that the Yeti may never appear to me again, that our encounter may have been a singular, a crossing of paths rather than the beginning of ongoing relationship, but this acceptance carries no bitterness because the gift was never about acquiring a supernatural companion, but about being broken open to a larger understanding of what consciousness is and how it manifests across forms that human language struggles to categorize. The young hunters who still occasionally seek my blessing before their expeditions carry within them the same potential that called to my grandmother and then to me, and I see my role now as simply keeping the door unlocked, maintaining the possibility that when the mountains choose their next candidate, someone will be present to offer that initial confirmation that makes the difference between integration and madness. When I die, which I feel approaching not with fear but with curious welcome, I have arranged for the feathers to be placed in the monastery's reliquary alongside other objects the monks do not fully understand but recognize as sacred through some instinct deeper than doctrine. Perhaps centuries from now, when the pendulum of human consciousness swings back toward the forms of knowing we have temporarily abandoned, someone will find those feathers and feel the question they carry, will sense the invitation still vibrating in their impossible whiteness, will be called toward the high valleys where beings of immense patience continue their vigil despite our determined forgetting. Until then, I continue my walks through the upper ranges where prayer flags mark the boundary between the world humans think they control and the older world that tolerates our presence, where massive footprints occasionally appear in fresh snow, like questions written in a language only certain souls can read, where the wind carries whispers that might be weather patterns or might be the ongoing conversation between intelligences we have trained ourselves not to perceive. I have learned to live inside uncertainty, the way I once lived inside the stone shelter of my family's house, have come to experience mystery not as problem requiring solution, but as the fundamental texture of an existence far richer than our small certainties could ever encompass. And this shift represents the creature's greatest gift, not answers, but the liberation that comes from finally asking the right questions, not proof, but the deeper satisfaction of direct encounter with the sacred, not mastery, but the profound relief of remembering that we were never meant to walk this world alone, that guardians still keep watch in the forgotten places, that the path home remains open for anyone willing to follow mysterious footprints into the trembling boundary lands where ancient covenants wait with infinite love for the moment when we finally remember who we truly are. What would you sacrifice to remember what humanity has forgotten? Subscribe to discover more encounters that exist beyond explanation.